السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. A new reflection related to the lockdown that we are in for the episode of COVID-19. And it's actually a very good opportunity for us to do some deep thinking and do some changes. It's very difficult to change the human soul and the human habits. But alhamdulillah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us this opportunity in order to reconnect with Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the best ways to reconnect with Him subhanahu wa ta'ala is to read His book, to read what He has to say subhanahu wa ta'ala that He sent to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, or rather through Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, for us to read, for us to reflect. It's very important that Muslims read the Quran for themselves. Yes, you could have a technical question about the law and you refer to some expert, but you should read the Quran for yourself because this is your own duty. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Won't they reflect upon this book? Or do they have locks on their hearts? So people who do not reflect on the book have locks on their hearts and have a major misunderstanding of what this religion, what this faith is all about. It's very important that we take this opportunity and start reading the Quran, but not in the ways that the Quran itself warned us from. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us 3 examples that we could mention related to 3 animals. That He subhanahu wa ta'ala said that when we read the Quran, we should not be like those who read the Quran in relation to these examples or similes that He gave subhanahu wa ta'ala with these 3 animals. The first animal is the donkey who carries the books. The donkey himself or herself is actually a believer. According to the Quran, all of the believing beings have their own prostration and their own prayers and their own tasbih, and they are regular with that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it as part of their nature to know Him and to worship Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when it comes to the Quran, if you put the books on the back of the donkey, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا. Those who were given the Torah to implement, or the book to implement, and then they didn't. They are like the donkey who carries books. The donkey who carries books doesn't understand what the books are carried for. And therefore, we do this sometimes. One reading of the Quran that we should avoid is to have the Quran on our desks, on our walls, and sometimes we even hear it or we memorize something, but we don't reflect. We don't carry it that is in our heart. And that is one fault and one error in reading the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning us from. The other error related to another animal that's given as a simile is the dog. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the hypocrites and that they are like a dog who is panting whether you let it rest or let it run. Always panting. That issue, that simile is actually a simile of somebody who has a crooked heart, a crooked nature, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, something wrong in themselves, in their nature. Again, the dog, him or herself, is actually an animal that knows Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and worships, and they have their own nations, like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that, and they have the life that is very knowledgeable of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the simile here is that the dog is always in a certain character or certain nature, and that nature doesn't change whether he hears the Quran or not, or whether he is reminded of the Quran or not. And that simile is important for us also to reflect upon and not to do like the hypocrites who did like that dog, of always going about their habits and what is considered to be a nature in them, even though if they dig deep into their hearts and find the good spot somewhere in their hearts, they can build on it, and they can start to wipe out the darkness from their hearts and become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third simile related to reading the Quran and listening to its instructions and commands is given through another animal, which is the cow. In fact, the whole chapter that's called Surah Al-Baqarah, or the chapter of the cow, the longest chapter in the Quran, it's named after this story because it's very significant. It's the story where Musa sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to his followers and told them that Allah is asking you to slaughter a cow. And then they went into all of these questions that are irrelevant to the application of the command. And that is a deviation, because eventually when he answered all of their questions, and it is a very special cow, he made it difficult for them the more they ask. Sometimes we ask about things when we read the Quran that we don't need to ask about. They are changeable with the change of time. As the Prophet ﷺ commented on this particular story, had they slaughtered any cow, it would have been enough for them. But they continued to question and question because they had something in their heart that has to do with not wanting to apply what the command is saying. That's why Allah at the end of the story subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَذَبَحُوهَا وَمَا كَادُوا يَفْعَلُونَ. They ended up slaughtering the cow, but they almost did not, because they really didn't want from the beginning. They kept asking trivial questions and going about superficial things. The number of the people in the cave, were they 5 or 7 or 9, and so forth. So when we read the Quran, and sometimes when we look into some interpretations, we should be very careful that we don't get into the issues that are not related to the practicality of it, to how it will fix your heart or fix the reality around you, fix the earth around you. When we read the Quran today as Muslims, and alhamdulillah, we have ample time to reconnect with the Quran, we need to look for themes. We need to look for topics. We need to answer questions, not like the question of the cow, superficial and frivolous questions, but questions of meaning about particular topics and about particular systems we see in today's world. And when we read the Quran with this thematic understanding, which inshallah we'll be talking more about during Ramadan, when we have a theme in our minds and we read the Quran looking for that theme, justice in our minds, and read the Quran and look how many forms of justice Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us. Mercy in the Quran, and look for how many forms and ways of mercy, not just His mercy subhanahu wa ta'ala and His names, whether the just or the merciful, but how this manifests in our lives as values and as objectives and as ways of thinking throughout the stories, throughout Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about the hereafter, when He talks about the history of humankind or even the natural history, and so forth. When we read the Quran with a theme in mind and with what I do in life in mind, then I reflect deeper on the Quran. If you are a physician, you will read the Quran differently, because keep your knowledge in mind as you read the Quran as a physician, and see what you can see in that book. You are a business person. You are a student who is looking for particular knowledge in a particular field of knowledge. You are somebody who counsels people with their problems. Look at how the Quran deals with the human psychology and the human mentality, and how it convinces us with certain facts, and how it takes us in certain gradualism, etc. When you work with charity, look at how the Quran deals with charity. These are not just numbers and percentages, and this is a spirit. And even a smile is a charity, as the Prophet ﷺ explained. And of course, the Sunnah is part of the Quran. The Quran is telling us to look at the Prophet's example as a bayan, as an illustration of the Quran. So an opportunity for us during that month to go back to the Quran and read. Keep the themes in mind. Don't be like the people who continue to ask about the cow and then they almost never slaughtered the cow, or the people who are like the donkey who carries the books but doesn't understand the books, or people who are like that dog who doesn't change his nature even though circumstances around him change and doesn't have any intention to change what is inside as a nature, we shouldn't be like any of these people. We should take it as an opportunity to change, as an opportunity to ask real questions about real issues and bring real insights to our lives. This is a duty. This is not just a scholar's duty. Of course, scholars read the Quran and they have to memorize it, but not all of the reading of the Quran is only for scholars. Every believer and non-believer, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, let's invite people to read the Quran. And let us give them copies of whatever language they understand, whether Arabic of the Quran or the translation of the meanings. Let's give them copies so that they can read the Quran. Forget about those who tell you that they cannot touch the Quran. How can they read it if they cannot touch it? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked them to read it right in the book. So let us reconnect with that book. This book, I will venture to say that, is highly unexplored. I work in the area of Islamic law and Islamic thought. I teach that. I've been doing that for decades. But I'm telling you about myself and about scholarship, Islamic scholarship in general, that this book is highly unexplored. We need to go back to that book, reconnect, and find a way to live Islam, inshallah, in the next stage of our lives, which will be very interesting. Live Islam in a new way, inshallah. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.